Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Sharks' quarterly grades for the defense and the goaltending. This was a bit of a tougher one to do for the defense because, as we all know, the defense for the San Jose Sharks has not been very good this season, but not for the normal reasons. The Sharks' underlying stats for basically all of their defensemen have actually been quite solid because of the fact that they don't allow the other team to get tons of zone time and tons of shots. Most of the mistakes from the Sharks' defense come from poor choices of plays, poor passes and things like that allow the other team to come in with only a single chance, but a single very, very good chance that has normally been put into the back of the Sharks' net. And so you look at games like against the Nashville Predators just recently, the Sharks gave up 4 goals, and yet I don't think any of them were generated by, let's say, some sort of consistent pressure, except for maybe the first one by Craig Smith, which ended up getting kicked into the net. And so as such, it's a bit hard to penalize the defense so hard because how much does Vlasic's grade, let's say, drop because of a few defensive misplays when in his own zone he's actually been quite sound defensively? It's a bit of a tougher call, but I'll start off with Brendan Dillon, as he is, of course, number 4. And Dillon has been okay this season. He's looked pretty good as of late with Erik Karlsson, but it didn't start off too well. He's not doing so much offensively, although it's not necessarily expected of Brendan Dillon to be doing that much offensively, but still you'd like to see a touch more from him, as he's only on pace for about 11, 12 points on the season. So you want to see a bit more from him, especially when he's playing with someone like Erik Karlsson. But it hasn't been too bad for him, and as such, he's going to get a grade of a B-. Next is Vlasic, and Vlasic's a tough one because at the start of the season he played with Erik Karlsson, and that pairing did not work that well. I don't know if it was Karlsson who was just not playing well that dragged Vlasic down, or Vlasic himself just wasn't playing that strong, but he had a lot of misplays in those first 2 games with Erik Karlsson as a defensive partner. Now that he's back with Justin Braun, he has looked better. There's still a couple of things, but still he has begun to look like the Vlasic of old. But there are a couple issues I've had with Vlasic. One, I'd like to see a bit more offense out of him. I think he had 11 or 12 goals last season, which was nice to see. Right now he's only sitting on the 1 a quarter of the way through, so that's only a pace of 4. And so I'd like to see at least something like 30-ish points out of Vlasic, which he's not on pace for at the moment, I don't believe. And so as such, it is a bit of a disappointing offensive, a bit of a disappointing defensive. And when you look at, let's say, Vlasic's expectations on the season, especially with Erik Karlsson coming in, there were some pretty high expectations for Marc-Edouard Vlasic as well, and he hasn't necessarily lived up to them too well. However, the defense has still been rather sound, as I said, for the good portion since he's been back with Braun, and as such he will also receive a B-. And I'll just point out, this doesn't mean that he's at the same level as Brendan Dillon. It's just that Brendan Dillon's expected skill level compared to Marc-Edouard Vlasic's expected skill level, it's a bit of a big difference. Next is Ryan. And Ryan, I thought, had a very good start to the season up until the game where he was against the Stars, and then the game after he got healthy scratched, obviously. I thought he was playing pretty well, even though he had very, very limited ice time. The game against the Stars didn't go particularly well. Then he was scratched against the Blues. He came back in the next game, and he looked okay. He's been getting a bit more ice time. However, he hasn't been looking as good as he was in the first bunch of games. However, it's still a pretty solid season, and you do have to shift some blame to Brent Burns, who hasn't been looking that great defensively in these past 3 or 4 games. He's been taking a ton of risks, which puts Joakim Ryan sort of in the spotlight to make the strong defensive play, and he's still a younger player, still doesn't have that many games under his belt, and so you can't fault him too much, which is why I'm going to give him a bit of a trend here, but another B-. Next is Justin Braun, and I think Braun has been doing rather well defensively, I would say. I think now he's with Vlasic at the moment, he's been very, very sound. I don't think there are as many defensive mistakes made by him compared to some of the other defensemen like Karlsson, Burns, even like Vlasic. I've really liked Braun's game for the majority of this season. Again, the offensive output by Justin Braun, it's not expected to be very, very high, but it is expected to be better than what he's at right now, which is 2-3 assists, if even that. I'm not 100% sure on his stats, but they aren't very good. And so you want to see some more offensive output from Justin Braun. However, his defensive game has remained quite solid this season, which is why he does get the grade of a B. Next is Erik Karlsson. And Karlsson This one is also interesting to think about because, during the first 18 games of this quarter, I'd say about 10 or 12 of them he wasn't very effective at all, and maybe even like 7 or 8 of them he was actually quite a bad player for the San Jose Sharks. He was not just like ineffective, but really bad for the Sharks, just causing multiple very bad giveaways that lead to easy scoring chances or goals or anything like that. However, in the games that Karlsson has been good in these past 3, as well as probably like 4 or 5 during the first 18, he has been one of the best players on the ice. He has been showing a few times that he still has the potential to be the player that he was in Ottawa, and it is a bit of you can give sort of a recency bias because it's been the past 3 games where he has been very, very good. However, it's hard to overlook the really, really poor start to the season that he did have, and as such, with the amount of expectations that were on him, I couldn't give him much higher than the grade of a C+. Next is Brent Burns, who has been having a rather solid quarter thus far. I'd say that it started off very, very well, both offensively, as Brent Burns was on a huge point streak. At a point, he's leading the team in points, but also he was quite strong defensively. It has fallen off a bit in these past few games. Brent Burns has been making a lot of unnecessary risks that have led to good chances the other way, so Brent Burns does maybe need to temper that a bit. However, it's still been a very, very successful season for Brent Burns. But again, as a defenseman core, as a forward, he might get a lot higher, but as a defenseman, you do have to consider the defensive part of the game a lot, which Brent Burns hasn't been that great at in these past few games, which does lower his mark a bit. Still, the best mark here at an A-. Now onto the goaltending, Martin Jones, and this is probably the most interesting one to actually evaluate because there's, you could have 2 different types of thought about Martin Jones. One, that the defense is failing him, Jones is doing his best, but the defense is giving up too many chances. Or you can be on the other end and say Jones has not been good enough. Yes, the defense hasn't been that great, but Jones is just not making any of the key saves. And so the grade does reflect that in a way. I think most of us can agree that the defense has not been good enough with these major turnovers that have led to fantastic chances. But I think we can also mostly agree that Martin Jones also hasn't been good enough, as he's not been making enough of the key saves. And as such, Jones's grade reflects this by getting the lowest on the board actually for today with a C. C is mostly sort of like, I guess it's not really an average at this point, it's mostly has a negative connotation to it, but still, it's one of those things that it can go up as long as the defense plays better, which will allow Jones to play better, and Jones just plays better in general. This can easily start to go up going into the next quarter, but if it remains sort of in a similar position in these next, let's say, 20 games, Martin Jones could be seeing C- or D+ for the following quarter. Finally, Aaron Dell, the backup goalie, he's only played about 6 games through these first quarter, and a couple of them weren't great, but he's been mostly solid. There have been some technical mistakes. I didn't like his rebounds against the St. Louis Blues, but he did get the shutout, so you do have to give a ton of marks for that. And so just in general, Aaron Dell has had some very good games, a couple of not that great games, but as a backup goalie, he's probably done just about as expected, exceeded expectations a bit as a backup, which is why he does get the grade of a B. Now again, this doesn't mean that I'm going to say that Aaron Dell is better than Martin Jones and that he should be the starter just because he has a higher grade. Again, Jones is based off of starting goalie expectations and Dell is based off of backup goalie expectations, and so Dell has exceeded while Jones has not. But that will do it for these Sharks defenseman grades. They were a bit tough to do because of how the defense itself has looked for the San Jose Sharks, because again, as I said, it's not sustained pressure, it's just bad giveaways. Class dismissed.